They say ignorance is bliss. I say ignorance is just a really good excuse for not having to buy a new wardrobe because your life imploded, until it doesn't. My personal implosion, however, came with a side of artisanal flatbread and a vintage Merlot. Because, of course, it did. My life apparently wasn't just a drama. It was a gourmet tragedy, served al fresco. It was a Tuesday. Not just any Tuesday, mind you, but the kind of Tuesday that pretends to be mundane, lulling you into a false sense of security before drop-kicking your reality into a parallel dimension where your husband has a secret life and a surprisingly adventurous palate. I was supposed to be at my weekly self-care yoga class, which, let's be honest, was mostly an excuse to lie on a mat and contemplate the existential dread of my laundry pile. But a sudden craving for their overpriced, yet undeniably delicious kale and quinoa salad at the Gilded Spoon, a place my husband Mark always claimed was too pretentious, diverted my path. And that, dear friends, is how I stumbled upon my own personal live-action soap opera. I walked in, head held high, ready to embrace my inner wellness warrior, when my eyes, those trusty, often ignored instruments of perception, landed on a table by the window. There he was, Mark, my husband of 12 years, looking entirely too comfortable, entirely too happy, and entirely too engaged with the woman across from him. And she wasn't me. Shocking, I know. It was Brenda from accounting. Brenda, who always smelled faintly of desperation and cheap perfume, and whose main contribution to office banter was her uncanny ability to mispronounce espresso. My first thought wasn't rage or heartbreak. It was, oh, for heaven's sake, Mark, Brenda? Really? You're going to burn our lives to the ground for someone who thinks a spreadsheet is a form of modern art? The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor, and I was the punchline. I paused, a silent, uninvited guest at the grand premiere of My Husband's Midlife Crisis, the Brenda edition. My initial reaction wasn't to scream or cry or even dramatically throw a breadstick. No, my mind immediately went to the logistics. Is this why he's been so busy at the office lately? Was Brenda his big project? Did she finally figure out how to balance the books and his emotional deficit? The absurdity of it all hit me like a rogue avocado pit. Here I was, standing in the doorway of a trendy, overpriced restaurant, witnessing the demise of my marriage, and my primary concern was the quality of his taste in illicit affairs. It was a testament to my coping mechanisms, or perhaps a sign I'd already checked out emotionally years ago. Mark, bless his oblivious heart, was laughing. A genuine, unburdened laugh I hadn't heard from him in what felt like a geological epoch. It was the kind of laugh you reserve for someone who truly gets you, someone who finds your mediocre jokes hilarious, someone who isn't constantly reminding you to take out the trash. And Brenda, with her perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that screamed, "I just won a minor lottery," was basking in it. They looked happy, disgustingly, offensively happy. And suddenly, a switch flipped inside me. The invisible woman, the one who floated through her own life unnoticed, the one whose opinions were often misunderstood or overly dramatic, decided she'd had enough of being a ghost. My therapist, bless her cotton socks, always said I had a unique perspective. I called it a finely tuned BS detector wrapped in a blanket of sarcasm. And at that moment, my BS detector was screaming like a banshee at a heavy metal concert. Mark had always treated me like a background extra in his grand narrative, a convenient placeholder until the real leading lady showed up. And here she was, Brenda, playing the role of the other woman, with all the subtlety of a foghorn in a library. It was almost poetic, in a deeply depressing, darkly comedic way. I didn't storm in. I didn't make a scene. That would have been too predictable, and frankly, too much effort. Instead, I calmly walked over to the hostess stand, a serene smile plastered on my face. "Table for one, please," I requested, my voice steady, betraying none of the seismic activity happening in my soul. The hostess, a young woman with more piercings than life experience, pointed to a small, intimate table. "Right this way, ma'am." And where did she lead me? To the table directly adjacent to Mark and Brenda's. Oh, the universe truly was a comedian. And I, apparently, was its favorite audience member. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and picked up the menu. My hand didn't tremble, my heart didn't pound. It was a bizarre calm, the kind you feel when you finally hit rock bottom and realize the only way up is to start digging. I glanced over at Mark and Brenda. They were still in their little bubble of illicit joy, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire world was about to get a very public, very sarcastic, very well-deserved shakeup. I ordered a glass of the most expensive Chardonnay and settled in. This wasn't just dinner, it was a front-row seat to the implosion of my own life, and I intended to enjoy every single, bitter, ironic bite. The show, it seemed, was just getting started. The Chardonnay arrived, a crisp golden liquid that promised to numb the edges of my burgeoning existential crisis. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes still fixed on the happy couple next to me. Mark was gesturing wildly, probably explaining the intricacies of his latest golf swing, or, perhaps, the profound meaning behind his favorite brand of artisanal cheese. Brenda was giggling, a sound that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard, but I forced myself to endure it. After all, this was research, and a good researcher never lets personal discomfort get in the way of a perfectly executed experiment in human folly. My mother-in-law always said family was everything, I mused internally, a dark chuckle bubbling up. Too bad she thought I was nothing. Or maybe a temporary placeholder until Mark found someone more spirited, which apparently meant Brenda from accounting. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife, and I almost asked the waiter for one. For years, I'd been the family's resident ghost, present at holidays, yet invisible in conversations. My opinions were dismissed as cute, my career choices quaint, and my very existence a mild inconvenience to Mark's grand narrative of a successful, unencumbered bachelor life, despite being married to me. Mark's family, a collection of well-meaning but utterly self-absorbed individuals, had perfected the art of the microaggression. "Oh, you're still doing that writing thing, dear?" his sister Carol would ask, as if my freelance journalism career was a quirky hobby like stamp collecting. "Mark looks so much happier now that he's settled," his mother would coo, conveniently ignoring the fact that I was the one who had settled him, paid half the mortgage, and remembered his mother's birthday every year. I was made a fool of, all right. And I thought my uncle, who once tried to juggle flaming bowling pins at a family reunion, was the family clown. Turns out, I was auditioning for the role of the tragic mime. The gaslighting had been a slow, insidious burn. "You're overreacting, darling," Mark would say, his voice dripping with condescension, whenever I dared to suggest he was spending too much time at work events that suspiciously coincided with Brenda's Instagram stories from various happy hours. "It's all in your head," he'd assure me, as if my intuition was a faulty GPS leading me astray. I started to believe it, to question my own sanity. Was I too sensitive? Too demanding? Was I the problem? The answer, apparently, was no. The problem was that Mark had found someone who didn't ask questions, someone who probably thought gaslighting was a new form of mood lighting. I watched Brenda lean in, whispering something to Mark, who then threw his head back in another one of those unholy, joyous laughs. My mind conjured a mental image of a giant L for loser, emblazoned on my forehead, blinking neon in the restaurant. But then another thought, sharper, more acidic, cut through the self-pity. "No, darling. You're not a loser. You're a producer. And this, right here, is compelling content." I took another sip of Chardonnay. The bitterness of betrayal was still there, but now it was mixed with a strange, almost exhilarating sense of detachment. This wasn't happening to me. It was happening for me. For my next great story. Or at least for a really good anecdote at my next therapy session. I remembered a particularly painful family dinner where Mark's cousin, a self-proclaimed life coach, had offered me unsolicited advice on finding my sparkle. Mark had just sat there, nodding along, occasionally interjecting with, "She really needs to get out more." Meanwhile, he was probably already getting out with Brenda. The irony was so rich, it was practically a dessert course. I had been so busy trying to be the good wife, the supportive partner, the invisible woman who doesn't rock the boat, that I'd forgotten I had a boat and a rather formidable one at that, and it was about to become a battleship. The waiter came by. "Everything to your liking, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a balm of professional indifference. "Oh, absolutely," I replied, a wide, almost maniacal smile spreading across my face. "The entertainment is simply exquisite." He looked confused, but I just waved him off. He wouldn't understand. He wasn't privy to the tragicomedy unfolding at table 7. Mark and Brenda were now feeding each other a single piece of tiramisu, a gesture so cliché it made my teeth ache. "Enemies of the state, and apparently of good taste," I muttered under my breath. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my best friend, Sarah. "How's yoga? Did you manage to achieve inner peace or just inner rage?" I typed back, "Currently achieving inner rage, but with a side of excellent people watching. Details to follow. Bring wine." The thought of Sarah's reaction, her explosive indignation on my behalf, brought a genuine smile to my face. She was one of the few who had always seen me, truly seen me, even when I was trying my best to disappear. And now, I was about to make a very public reappearance. The idea, audacious and utterly insane, began to solidify in my mind. It wasn't enough to just witness their betrayal. It wasn't enough to just feel the sting of humiliation. I needed to turn the tables. I needed to make them the spectacle. And I knew just the person to help me orchestrate the grand finale. The one person Mark would least expect. The one person who, like me, was probably also living in a state of blissful ignorance. Or perhaps just a well-maintained delusion. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over the search bar. Time to find Brenda's husband. The game, as they say, was officially afoot. The search for Brenda's husband was surprisingly easy. Turns out, Brenda was less discreet with her personal life online than she was with her office affairs. A quick dive into the murky waters of social media, and there he was, Gary Miller. A man whose profile picture featured him proudly holding a prize-winning pumpkin, looking exactly like the kind of person who'd be blissfully unaware that his wife was moonlighting as a homewrecker. He seemed wholesome, unsuspecting, the perfect unwitting accomplice in my theatrical revenge. My plan was so discreet, so elegantly simple, that even the CIA would take notes, between sips of their lukewarm coffee. It wasn't about violence or public shaming in the traditional sense. It was about exposing the absurdity, the sheer pathetic nature of their clandestine romance, with a dash of situational comedy. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a punchline. And Gary, the pumpkin enthusiast, was about to become an integral part of it. I found his work email through a quick LinkedIn search. I debated my opening line for an hour, drafting and deleting, trying to strike the perfect balance between, "I know your wife is sleeping with my husband," and, "Hello, fellow human, let's orchestrate a public display of marital infidelity." I settled on something deceptively innocuous. "Dear Mr. Miller, I believe we have a mutual interest in a certain professional matter. I'd like to discuss it over coffee, urgently, and perhaps with a strong dose of cynicism." I signed it, "A concerned party who prefers her drama with a side of strategy." He replied within the hour. "Intriguing. Coffee tomorrow at 9 a.m.? The Gilded Spoon?" The Gilded Spoon! The universe truly was my co-writer. Or perhaps my personal sadist. I chuckled. This was going to be easier than I thought. Or harder. Probably both. The next morning, I arrived at the Gilded Spoon, precisely at 8:55 a.m., dressed in my most, "I'm here for a serious conversation, but also I could be on my way to a brunch with my fabulous single friends outfit." Gary was already there, a man in his late 40s with kind eyes and a receding hairline that suggested a life of quiet contentment, now about to be shattered. He looked nervous, fiddling with his coffee cup. "Mr. Miller," I began, extending my hand. "It's a pleasure. Or perhaps a shared misfortune." He blinked. "Ms. Just call me Alex," I said, taking the seat opposite him. "And let's cut to the chase, shall we? Your wife, Brenda, is having an affair with my husband, Mark." His face went from pale to ghostly. His jaw dropped, then snapped shut. He looked like a goldfish who'd just been told the ocean was actually a giant toilet. I don't understand," he stammered. Oh, I think you do, I countered, my voice calm, almost clinical. They were here at this very restaurant last Tuesday, feeding each other tiramisu. It was quite the show, very dramatic. Lacked a bit of originality, though, if I'm honest. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Brenda. And Mark? But Mark is married. To you. Precisely, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. Which makes this whole thing rather messy, wouldn't you agree? And frankly, a little insulting. I mean, Brenda? The woman who still uses a flip phone? He flinched. She says it's for privacy. Right. Privacy from common sense, maybe, I quipped. Look, Gary, I'm not here to commiserate or to cry on your shoulder. My tear ducts have been on strike for years. I'm here because I have a proposition, a way to turn this pathetic little drama into something memorable. He looked utterly bewildered. A proposition? Indeed, I leaned forward, my voice dropping conspiratorially. They've made us the punchline, Gary. The unsuspecting dupes, the background noise. But what if we flipped the script? What if we showed them that we're not just invisible, we're strategically camouflaged? He still looked lost, but a flicker of something, curiosity, desperation, sparked in his eyes. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we have dinner, I said, a mischievous glint in my eye. At the Gilded Spoon, this Friday, at the table right next to theirs. And we'll make sure they know we're there. Not with shouting or accusations, but with quiet, dignified, utterly devastating presence. We'll be the elephant in the room, wearing a very expensive suit. Gary swallowed hard. You want us to have dinner with them? While they're on a date? Oh, not with them, Gary. Next to them, I corrected, a wicked smile playing on my lips. We'll be the living, breathing embodiment of their poor life choices. We'll be the consequence they never saw coming, served with a side of artisanal flatbread and a vintage Merlot. And maybe, just maybe, we'll order the tiramisu. He sat in silence for a long moment, processing. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, the initial shock giving way to a nascent anger, a slow burn of indignation. He was a pumpkin enthusiast, not a pushover. And I, apparently, was a master manipulator of unsuspecting, betrayed husbands. My wife, she said I was too predictable, Gary finally said, his voice low, a hint of steel in it. She said I never took risks. Well, Gary, I said, raising my coffee cup in a silent toast, consider this your grand adventure, your moment to shine, your chance to prove that you're not just a man who grows prize-winning pumpkins, but a man who can also orchestrate a public humiliation with the precision of a Swiss watch. What do you say? Are you in? He looked at me, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration in his eyes. Then a slow, determined nod. I'm in, Alex. What time? 8 o'clock sharp, I replied, a triumphant grin spreading across my face. And wear something nice. It's going to be quite the show. My plan was so deliciously devious, so perfectly understated, that it was almost a work of art. And the best part? Mark and Brenda wouldn't even know they were the canvas until it was too late. Friday night arrived with the ominous glow of a perfectly executed plan. Gary and I were at the Gilded Spoon, precisely at 7:55 p.m. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking less like a pumpkin farmer and more like a man about to deliver a very subtle, yet devastating blow. I was in a sleek black dress, radiating an aura of calm confidence that belied the controlled chaos simmering beneath. We were a picture of elegant vengeance, a duo of wronged spouses ready to serve justice with a side of artisanal flatbread. We were seated at our prearranged table, strategically placed, of course, right next to the one Mark and Brenda usually occupied. The restaurant was bustling, a symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversations. The air hummed with anticipation. At least for me. Gary, bless his nervous heart, was fidgeting with his napkin. Are you sure about this, Alex? He whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient chatter. Gary, I said, a serene smile on my face. We're not here to cause a scene. We're here to be the scene. To be the silent, undeniable truth that crashes their little fantasy. Think of it as performance art. We're the avant-garde, and they're about to get a very unexpected critique. Just then, the hostess led Mark and Brenda to their usual table. Mark, looking smug and self-satisfied, was in his favorite navy blazer. Brenda, in a dress that was perhaps a tad too tight, was practically preening. They settled in, oblivious, their laughter already echoing a little too loudly in the intimate space. Mark was mid-sentence, probably explaining the intricacies of his latest business deal, when his eyes, finally, drifted to our table. His smile faltered. His eyes widened. He blinked once, then twice, as if trying to reboot his brain. Brenda, still giggling, nudged him. "What is it, sweetie?" she purred. She followed his gaze, and her face, usually a canvas of carefully applied makeup, went from a healthy flush to the color of unbleached flour. The silence that descended upon their table was deafening. It was the kind of silence that screams louder than any argument. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Brenda's hand flew to her mouth, as if to stifle a gasp that had already escaped her eyes. Gary, sensing the shift, looked at me. I simply raised my hand and waved, a small, polite gesture. "Mark! Brenda! What a delightful surprise!" I chirped, my voice carrying just enough to be heard at their table, but not so much as to alert the entire restaurant. "Fancy meeting you here. We just love the Gilded Spoon, don't we, Gary?" Gary, bless him, managed a weak, strangled, "Indeed." Mark looked like he'd seen a ghost. Or perhaps two very alive, very well-dressed ghosts who were about to ruin his perfectly curated evening. "Alex? Gary? What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "Oh, just enjoying a lovely dinner," I replied, picking up my menu. "Gary and I were just discussing the merits of the Chilean sea bass. Have you tried it, Mark? It's simply divine, almost as divine as the irony of this moment." I winked at Gary, who actually managed a small, nervous chuckle. Brenda, meanwhile, was turning various shades of crimson. She tried to whisper something to Mark, but he was too busy staring at us, his face a mask of utter bewilderment and growing panic. "Isn't this cozy?" I continued, ignoring their stunned silence. "It's almost like a double date, wouldn't you say? Though I suppose that would imply a certain honesty in our relationships, which, is so last season." Mark finally found his voice, a strained whisper. "Alex, we need to talk." "Oh, darling, we are talking," I said, taking a sip of my water. "Or rather, I am. You two seem a little speechless. Perhaps the artisanal flatbread has finally choked you into submission?" The waiter arrived at our table. "Are you ready to order, ma'am?" "We are," I said, giving Gary a conspiratorial look. "We'll have the Chilean sea bass, 2 orders, and a bottle of that lovely vintage Merlot. And for dessert," I paused, looking directly at Mark and Brenda, who were now practically fused to their chairs. "We'll have the tiramisu, 2 orders. It's simply to die for." The waiter jotted it down, oblivious to the silent war being waged. Mark and Brenda, meanwhile, were having a very public, very quiet meltdown. Mark's face was beet red, a vein throbbing in his temple. Brenda was picking at her cuticles, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially Gary. Gary, emboldened by my performance, leaned in slightly. "You know, Mark," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "Brenda always said you were a man of integrity. Funny how things change, isn't it?" Mark flinched as if struck. "Gary, this isn't what it looks like." "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like, Mark," I interjected, a sweet smile on my face. "It looks like you two decided to play house and forgot to tell the actual homeowners. And now, the homeowners are here, enjoying a very expensive meal on your dime, metaphorically speaking. Though, if you'd like to pick up our tab, I wouldn't say no." Brenda finally spoke, her voice a reedy squeak. "Gary, please, this is humiliating." "Humiliating?" Gary retorted, a spark of genuine anger in his eyes. "You know what's humiliating, Brenda? Finding out your wife is having an affair with a man who thinks Netflix and chill is a legitimate date night. And doing it in our favorite restaurant, no less." The word affair hung in the air, a tiny, explosive grenade. Heads at nearby tables subtly turned. Mark and Brenda looked like deer caught in headlights, exposed, vulnerable, and utterly pathetic. The satisfaction that coursed through me was a warm, delicious wave. Never imagined that a simple dinner reservation would leave so many grown adults pale, and none of them were even into art. This wasn't just justice. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive triumph, and the tiramisu was going to taste glorious. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in awkward silence from their side, and delightful, understated banter from ours. Mark and Brenda barely touched their food. They whispered furiously, occasionally casting horrified glances our way. Gary, once timid, found his stride, occasionally making a pointed comment about fidelity or honesty that would make Brenda visibly shrink. I, meanwhile, regaled Gary with anecdotes about Mark's questionable fashion choices and his inability to load a dishwasher correctly, all within earshot. It was glorious. They left abruptly, Mark practically dragging Brenda out, their faces a mottled mess of shame and fury. As they scurried past our table, Mark shot me a look that promised retribution, but all I did was smile sweetly and wave. "Do try the tiramisu next time, darling," I called out, just loud enough for a few other diners to hear. The satisfied murmurs and curious glances that followed them out were the sweetest symphony I'd ever heard. Gary and I lingered, enjoying our tiramisu, which, I must admit, tasted like victory. We talked for a long time, not just about the betrayal, but about life, about what we wanted next. He was a good man, Gary. A little naive, perhaps, but fundamentally decent. We didn't promise each other anything beyond a shared understanding and a mutual appreciation for strategically placed public humiliation. The aftermath was, predictably, a circus. Mark tried to call me, to explain, to apologize, to gaslight me into believing I was the crazy one. I blocked his number. He sent furious texts, then pathetic ones. I archived them. He even showed up at my apartment looking disheveled, but I simply called building security. The man who once made me feel invisible was now desperately trying to be seen, and I found a perverse pleasure in denying him that. Brenda, I heard, was transferred to a different department, far, far away from Mark. Gary filed for divorce the next week. I did too. The legal proceedings were surprisingly swift, given how much Mark wanted to avoid any more public spectacles. He signed the papers with a grimace, looking like he'd swallowed a lemon. I, on the other hand, signed with a flourish, feeling lighter than I had in years. Never imagined a signature on a piece of paper could make so many grown men pale, and none of them were given to the arts. Life after Mark and Brenda became a strange, exhilarating new normal. I kept my apartment, got a new cat, named Karma, naturally, and started writing again, but this time for myself. I found a new therapist who actually laughed at my jokes, which was a refreshing change. I even went on a few dates, mostly for research purposes, and quickly realized that the dating pool was less a pool and more a murky swamp filled with questionable creatures. But at least I was seeing them, truly seeing them, without the filter of denial. I learned a lot from that Tuesday at the Gilded Spoon. I learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, strategic display of your own unshakable sanity. I learned that being underestimated is a superpower, a secret weapon you can wield with devastating precision. And I learned that while family might be complicated, messy, and occasionally infuriating, the ones who truly matter are the ones who don't laugh at your face, only at the joke you've become. And sometimes, you get to write the punchline.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.